I'm Hugh Patrick, and it's my happy opportunity to welcome you to this special event, co-sponsored by the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the Center on Japanese Economy and Business. Following the lecture by Professor Curtis, we'll have time for Q&A, and then we'll end about 7:30 and have a brief reception outside, and that'll give you a chance to meet him more informally and also to meet each other. I think the technical term is networking. As I said, I'm really enjoy the opportunity for me to introduce our speaker on special occasions such as this, Gerald Curtis, Burgess Professor of Political Science. I have some biases, but I think I am unbiased in saying that I think he's the best, most knowledgeable specialist on Japanese politics, not only in the United States, but anywhere outside Japan. He usually spends a spring semester in Japan, and then we catch him in the fall to give whatever his latest views and insights are. This year he's on academic leave, but he's graciously agreed to talk with us all here this evening. You know, it's a sort of interesting thing that major events in Japanese politics in recent years have had a huge correlation with the beginning of the school year at Columbia University. And I guess that just is another example of why correlation and causality are not necessarily the same thing. Because I don't think that, despite Jerry's insights and power, that he's the one who decides who's going to be the next prime minister. Anyway, as you know, last week, Naoto Kan retained his prime ministership by his election to the Democratic Party of Japan presidency. Every year for the last 5 years or so, in September, when Jerry has spoken, he's correctly predicted up until last year that there would be a new prime minister a year hence. And last year, I think, like many of us who were very impressed by the strong support for the DPJ, Minjuto, many of us thought, and he was among them, and I always think whatever he tells me to think about this, that Yukio Hatayama would be prime minister for at least a couple of years. And as you know, and as he will discuss, this has been in a period of incredible political turmoil, almost accelerating political turmoil over this past year. The materials you have, I assume, you have them, provide a brief introduction to Professor Curtis's career, so I won't repeat that. I do want to make two general points. First, he's known personally every prime minister for the last 30 years, meeting with them privately, with the exception of one prime minister who only stayed in office for 2 or 3 months. And perhaps more importantly, he knows well and meets with leaders from throughout the political perspective or prisms, DPJ, LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, Komeito, your party, if that's the right translation, and so forth. And he has this extraordinary network of politicians, business leaders, and government officials in Japan. And as a result of that, he's sort of developed a unique insider-outsider set of relationships. He's an outsider because he's not Japanese, because he's an academic, and because he has no hidden agenda or particular axe to grind. He's an insider because he's fluent in Japanese, is trustworthy and not revealing private information from private conversations, and because he does, he can and does express his frank views both privately and in public fora such as this. That's my first point. My second point is that Jerry Curtis is a skilled jazz pianist, which maybe many of you don't know. When he was doing his PhD research in Tokyo, he was playing in jazz bars, and one of the concerns was whether he would ever come back and finish his PhD. Fortunately, I think for Japanese studies and for our understanding of Japan, he did, and he embarked on the illustrious academic career that he's had. But in recent years, he has been once again studying and practicing the piano a lot, quite a lot anyway, and so I'm happy to announce that the Jerry Curtis Trio will have its professional debut in Tokyo on November 20, and he will be joined by the famous saxophonist Sadao Watanabe. So if any of you are in Tokyo, buy a ticket. It's not a freebie.
At the Shinjuku Pit Inn.
Yes. Say that out loud, Jerry, so everybody can hear.
The performance is at a place called Pit Inn in Shinjuku, the Shinjuku Pit Inn, and it's Sadao Watanabe and my trio.
Anyway, we're looking forward to a really interesting, enjoyable talk tonight, and only a figurative piano playing, I guess. So, Jerry, explain to us about turmoil, political turmoil in Japan.
Thanks, Hugh. And it's a pleasure to see so many people here for this conversation about the political turmoil in Japan. But since he mentioned my my jazz side, I want to put in a plug for my friend Watanabe Sadao. He's playing in New York on the 27th and 28th at the Dizzy Club Coca-Cola. I'm not playing with him, but he has a great group that's playing with him, so if you want to hear great saxophone player, and I was just looking on the internet. There's a student discount. It's very reasonable. And I encourage you to go listen to Watanabe. He's a wonderful, wonderful musician. And I got to know him recently. We've played together in Tokyo, and now I'm going to have this big gig in November. So that's really exciting. In some ways, for me, that's kind of more exciting right now than Japanese politics. But you know, Japanese politics is always exciting, always interesting, even when it's depressing. As it's been, especially since last September. You know, when I spoke here at this time last year, I didn't use the word optimistic. I said I wasn't optimistic about the DPJ, but I was really hopeful that this party with Hatoyama as prime minister and a reform agenda to change the way politics is played in Japan, to shift the focus of policy away from rewarding the special interests that back the LDP to responding to the needs of the population as a whole, that there was reason to be hopeful that this would be a positive change. And then what we saw in the subsequent months was the impressive manner in which the DPJ turned opportunity into disaster. 9 months after coming to power, Hatoyama was gone. First, his coalition partner, one of his coalition partners, the Democratic Socialist Party, Social Democratic Party, bolted the coalition because of his reversal of his position on where to move an American military base, Marine Air Base, at a place called Futenma. First saying it would have to be moved out of Okinawa, in the end ending up supporting the position the LDP had taken all along. He lost the socialists, and finally he lost the public's confidence, and he had to quit. So I was really running, I had a good streak going here. Every year I would come and say, this prime minister is not going to last. I come back the next year, and I could proudly, not proudly, but I could say, yeah, you see, he didn't last. That happened with Abe, and then Fukuda, and Aso. So I was getting tired of predicting that the prime minister wouldn't last. So last year I decided this one is going to last. So what you're not going to hear from me say tonight is how long I think Mr. Khan is going to be prime minister. And I don't want to spend time engaging in those kinds of predictions, how popular the DPJ will be a year from now and so on. What I do want to do is to try to think through with you what accounts for this turmoil, what accounts for the DPJ's failure to respond to the public's expectations. What is going on in Japanese politics that have implications for the future in terms of the structure of politics or the way politics is performed and the kinds of policies that are likely to be carried out. Khan just last week, formed a new government, replaced a little bit more than half of his cabinet ministers, replaced all except one, I think, of the senior vice ministers and the parliamentary secretaries. He got elected to a full 2-year term as president of the DPJ. You see, they have this is something the LDP started some years ago, and it's a crazy system where the president, if someone quits as head of the LDP or head of the DPJ, this wasn't true in years past, but in recent years, the person who was selected to succeed him is only elected to fill out his term. So Mr. Khan was elected to succeed Mr. Hatoyama, but only for the remaining months of Hatoyama's term, so he had to face another election. And that was this face-off with Mr. Ozawa, which I'll get into in a few minutes. So first of all, let's think a little bit about why this political turmoil and what is going on, what's happening in Japanese politics more long term. The first point is this. First of all, the DPJ victory last fall, the election in August, then the government in September, that victory is best seen as the consequence of the LDP's collapse, rather than the LDP's defeat being the consequence of the DPJ's success, okay? So what happened last August in that election was not that the voters said, this DPJ is a wonderful party, they're really exciting, they got all kinds of great ideas. It was, we're really fed up with the LDP, and finally kicked them out of office. In spite of the public disillusionment with the Democrats, there has been no increase of support for the LDP. If anything, that party grows weaker and weaker. Key people like Mr. Watanabe Yoshimi left and formed his own party. Others who were well known, Matsuzoe and so on, left. Yosano and left. Many of the key players in the LDP left. The party is going nowhere. It doesn't have can't come up with a coherent program of its own. So for the moment, what you have, instead of the long period of stable one-party dominance in Japan, now you have an unstable political system with another, for the time, dominant party. The DPJ is the largest and the most popular party in Japan, and no other party comes close. So the LDP's collapse didn't happen overnight. It's the culmination of long-term trends. The weakening of its vote-gathering political machine, the dominance of the party by these old-style political bosses whose views were increasingly out of tune with the values and the concerns of the public, and so on. And students here, you should be taking Kei Shimizu's course to find out more about these kinds of issues relating to what led up to what happened last August. But when the voters voted the LDP out, they were pretty skeptical about the DPJ. They still are. So some of the key planks in the DPJ platform were really not all that popular or weren't really embraced by the public. Child support policy, Only 30% in the last polls taken before the election, only about a little more than 30% of the public thought it was a great idea to give everybody, to give families, 13,000 yen a month the first year and 26,000 yen from there out for each child they had. This was not all that popular, and now the DPJ, because of the, that would, at full funding, that's more than the Japanese defense budget, over 5 trillion yen a year. They've backed away, they've cut back on that program. Making highways free, eliminating tolls on highways. Big issue for the DPJ, but only 20% of the public thought this made much sense. And now virtually nobody thinks it makes much sense, including the DPJ, which had to move away from that program. So the voters were skeptical, but they wanted to believe that things would be better, and they gave the party the benefit of the doubt at the beginning. And as I've just kind of indicated, even with the disappointment in Hatoyama and the way the government has performed, the DPJ is still the most popular of the political parties in the country. What accounts for the DPJ's failure? I think it's two things over and above all. One is simply inexperience at governing, and inadequate preparations to take over the government. Only 2 members of the Hatoyama government had ever served in the cabinet. Mr. Khan, who had been health and welfare minister many years ago in a coalition government, and Mr. Fuji, who was the first finance minister, who was finance minister when Mr. Hosokawa was prime minister 20 some odd years ago. When Obama and McCain ran for the presidency, before even the election was held, each received classified briefings, right, on key foreign policy issues. Each got briefed by key domestic economic people in the government dealing with domestic, economic, social, and other issues. There was a transition team. When Obama was elected, he had several months in which his transition team worked with him to put together a cabinet, identify the key policy issues, and so on. There was no transition team in Japan. There were no briefings of Hatoyama and the cabinet about Tenma. There was no access to the data held by the government about all kinds of issues. These people came into office inexperienced and unprepared. And the US, the Obama administration, is to be faulted for not being more responsive to this, for not taking into consideration more this reality. I think I said here, I haven't looked at my notes from last year, but I'm pretty sure I said, I was saying it everywhere I could, the most important word for the Obama administration, I was saying last September, October, the most important word is wait. You need to give these people time to figure out what the options are on key issues. The Obama administration should have said to Hatoyama, don't rush to make a decision on Tenma. Think it through, because when you think it through, there isn't really a good option other than the one that it took the LDP and the U.S. More than a decade to arrive at, which was to move it to this place called Hinoko. But instead, within a month of Hatoyama becoming prime minister, Defense Secretary Gates flew out to Tokyo to say, this is it. We're not interested in discussing reopening this issue. It's time to move on. Just sign on the dotted line and let's get on with it. So the end result was that this made the issue more complicated and more difficult to resolve. So inexperience, lack of knowledge of the issues, and what you often see with new people in power, a tendency to speak out publicly about, sort of to ruminate publicly about what they might do, which is not what you want your leaders to do. So Okada was talking about maybe, I keep on returning to this tema issue because it's a very important issue in U.S.-Japan relations, but raising the possibility maybe we combine it with the Air Force base somewhere else in Okinawa at Kadena, maybe move it to some island nobody had ever heard of before, so forth and so on. But in a sense, this was to be expected. That is, it is when you're inexperienced, you tend to make mistakes, and that would improve with time. And before I move on to the other point, one of the other problems of this lack of experience, kind of being new on the job, was the difficulty this government faced in mobilizing the expertise of the bureaucracy. And the blame lies pretty much on both sides. On the political side, that is on the side of the government, of the cabinet, there's in Japanese an expression called Seiji Shudo, or the politicians in charge. And in this, in the DPJ, there's been, and there still is, a sense that that means that politicians are going to make decisions, not bureaucrats, which is fine, but who's going to provide the expertise in a country in which there aren't think tanks that are comparable to what we have here, where there aren't people outside of the bureaucracy who provide the kind of policy expertise that you find elsewhere. But Seiji Shudo meant that the so-called, another Japanese term, the sanyaku, the minister, the senior vice minister, and the parliamentary secretary, the three political appointees in the cabinet, they would meet and they would decide what the policies were, and they would tell the bureaucrats, and then the bureaucrats would carry it out. And so they would meet, and they wouldn't have the bureaucrats in the room, and they would make decisions. And the system didn't work. One day, a first-term DPJ member came to see me in my office in Tokyo. He had started out his career as a bureaucrat in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, and now he was in the DPJ. And he came and he said, he wanted me to come and speak to a group of first-term members, but he was saying, this is crazy. He said, what the parliamentary secretary, the Seimujikan, what he does is what I did as kakaricho when I was, was kind of a subsection chief, when I was in Medi. In other words, a lot of these politicians were running around doing the jobs that bureaucrats should be doing instead of overseeing what they were doing. And on the bureaucratic side, there was a lot of resistance, a lot of sabotage, and bad-mouthing of the political leadership, which if it were Britain or another parliamentary democracy, they would have had them sacked in no time short. So there are all kinds of problems that come when you have a new government after 50 years of only one party basically being in charge. But these problems wouldn't have been so severe if there had been strong leadership from the prime minister. So Hatoyama's ineptitude, his inability to lead, is the story here. And it showed in so many different ways. His public statements, they were inconsistent, and they were abstract to the point where they raised questions in people's minds, especially in the minds of people in Washington, about what his real agenda was. Was his talk of an East Asia community really meant to mean that Japan was going to somehow side with China and with Asia and downplay the U.S. relationship? Fraternity, UI, an equal relationship with the U.S., by which he seemed mainly to mean that Japan should be able to say no more readily rather than indicate what Japan was prepared to do. There was a lot of suspicion about Hatoyama in Washington from the beginning. I thought it was totally unrealistic. That is, the idea that Hatoyama had some kind of a hidden real agenda, His problem was he didn't have a real agenda. His problem was when he talked about the East Asian community, he didn't really mean very much more than what he said. It would be so nice if people could hold hands and get along well together. This is what we now, I think a lot of people now recognize is the reality about Mr. Hatayama. But he had been prime minister of the country, so created all kinds of problems. Then he was a weak prime minister. I've known Hatayama for many years, and believe it or not, I like him. He's a nice person, but you know, nice people don't necessarily make good prime ministers. He's a good example. He let himself be pushed around and humiliated by a man in the cabinet who was the head of a tiny party, 4 or 5 members, Mr. Kame and his National People's Party. So Mr. Kame, early on in the administration, said, well, if Hatayama wants to fire me, let him go ahead and try. He can't do it. Humiliating him in public. And Hatayama sort of sitting there and taking it, and sending a signal to everybody in the cabinet that this was a government without a control tower, that everybody could say pretty much whatever he wanted. And what made the situation worse was that he deferred to Mr. Ozawa on everything having to do with sort of running the party. It struck me, Hatayama in his statements in the Diet would say, well, you know, as the head of the government, head of the administration, I think this, that, and the other thing. But the question you just raised has to do with the party, and that means Mr. Ozawa. Well, he's the president of the DPJ. Mr. Ozawa is not the president of the DPJ, but he deferred to Ozawa. And as the months went by, Ozawa not liking what he was seeing happening on the government side, became more and more impatient and influential in influencing the policy process. In the end, they made a mockery of the major reform that this government said it was going to carry out, which was the center policy in the cabinet, and to have the party sort of carry out the policies that the government adopted. So Ozawa's power continued to grow, and this became a kind of Hatayama-Ozawa government in which Ozawa was the real power behind the throne. Finally, with an upper house election looming and Hatayama's popularity collapsing and the Socialist Party departing, he quit. He quit in June, and Khan became the president of the party and the prime minister. But as you know, he had to face another election for the presidency of the DPJ just a few weeks ago. But there was the upper house election in July, mid-July. It would have been a difficult election under any circumstances because the government had proved itself, had lost so much public support. But Khan made it worse because of the way he raised the issue of possibly increasing the consumption tax. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this issue here. We're going to have a lot of time for questions tonight, so I'm sure something will come up about it. But public opinion about the consumption tax increase has really changed a lot over the last 20 years. It used to be the kiss of death for a politician to raise the issue of the consumption tax and tremendous public opposition to it. Now, for better or for worse, probably for worse, there's a lot of public support or a lot of public acceptance of the argument that Japan has to increase its tax base, and the way to do that is by increasing the consumption tax. But the way that Khan raised the issue, the sense that he really wasn't clear what he had in mind, and the idea of raising no country is the idea of raising taxes usually a popular issue in which to go to an election. The DPJ did very badly and lost its majority in the upper house. The result is that now gridlock, nejire in Japanese, this what they call a twisted diet, basically gridlock. Gridlock is much worse now than it was when the LDP was in its last years. Then the LDP, ever since Koizumi, they didn't have a majority in the upper house either, but they had 2/3 of the seats in the lower house. So they could override an upper house rejection of legislation with a 2/3 vote in the lower house. The DPJ doesn't have 2/3 of the seats in the lower house. It doesn't have a majority in the upper house. So no legislation can pass that the opposition wants to defeat. Budget only requires the passage in the lower house. But there's a lot of ancillary related legislation that has to be passed by the upper house as well. Unless the DPJ gets some support from some of the opposition parties on these issues, this gridlock will simply prevent any significant important policies from being adopted. And the position, the attitude of the opposition parties in Japan towards Kan is not unlike the Republicans here towards Obama. Why come to a compromise with Obama that will make him look more, that will help him look good with the midterm elections coming up? So the tendency, the inclination is to oppose everything that Obama wants and then go to the electorate and show and with the argument that Obama's ineffective. And that's the position of the opposition in Japan. They want to force an early election because everybody believes that as in the next lower house election, the DPJ will do worse, and and some of the other parties will have to do better than happened the last time. So this is the situation Mr. Kan found himself in. Low popular support. When he first came in, the public wanted to be enthusiastic. You know, they want to believe that someone's going to get it right. Then he raised the consumption tax issue in a way that was that disappointed people. Popularity went down. But then, in one of the great ironies that makes politics interesting, Mr. Ozawa rode to Mr. Kan's rescue. His intention was to drive him out of office, but the end result was that he has made Kan much stronger than he would have been if Ozawa had not run. Mr. Kan had ignored Ozawa, told him he should be quiet for a while. What was I going to say? And he got him, and Kan got himself into trouble with the consumption tax, and so on. So Mr. Hatoyama tried to mediate and get Kan to agree to form a kind of what they called a troika with Hatoyama, Ozawa, and Kan. And Kan refused. And the public liked the fact that he refused and stood up to Ozawa. It was at that point that Mr. Ozawa decided he had to run in the election. If he hadn't run, he'd have no influence. Kan had kept him out and showed no inclination to bring him back in. So Ozawa's strategy was quite clear. I don't think that Ozawa thought he had much chance to win. You know, lightning might strike, he might win, become prime minister. But in the way that Mr. Ozawa and his henchmen, the kind of people that are like him in the party think, even if he lost, he would show that at least maybe half of the Diet members support Ozawa and not Kan. And that's in fact what happened in the election. About half of the Diet members supported Ozawa. Kan won because he then got a very large percentage of the support from the rank and file party members and local politicians. So that even if he lost, Ozawa would be in a strong bargaining position and Khan would have to bring him back in. I think that was the thinking. But Khan hasn't done it. And that has, again, made his popularity go up. So there's so far been very little payoff for Mr. Ozawa from this election. The key people in this government are known for being people who don't get along or don't like or don't want Mr. Ozawa to have any influence in the government. Mr. Sengoku, the chief cabinet secretary. Mr. Okada, now the foreign minister who's now become Secretary General of the party. No member of the Ozawa group was appointed to the cabinet as in a cabinet minister's position. Just today, in our time, the senior vice ministers and parliamentary secretaries were announced, and there's several Ozawa people that had gotten appointments as these vice ministers. This is a very skillful move on the part of Mr. Khan. It's the minister who has the power. The vice minister is going to learn that a lot of the things that Mr. Ozawa wanted to get done can't be done. And he's in fact going to co-opting or bringing Ozawa people into the government in a way to co-opt them. And those on the party side and on the diet management side who have are Khan people. So I think the Japanese media overplays how much this is a factional game. It's not like the LDP. It's not so much so, but I think Khan so far has demonstrated a lot of political skill in the last few weeks in containing Ozawa and in showing, in seeming to show the public that he has much more of a backbone than a lot of people thought. So the result has been strong public support. Now 65 to 70% of the public supports Mr. Khan. And there seem to be two reasons, right? One is he's stood up to Mr. Ozawa, who's kind of anathema to the great majority of the Japanese public. And the second is that his cabinet is really interesting. It's exciting, I think, for a lot of Japanese to see these young faces, new faces, and a new style of politics being represented in this cabinet. The new foreign minister, Mr. Maehara, who was the Minister of Land Transportation in this previous government. I mean, he's well known, and especially well known in Washington, as someone who really understands foreign policy issues. He's young, he's in his 40s. Mr. Okada, the Secretary General. Noda, the Finance Minister. Renho, Taiwanese father, Japanese mother. Matsumoto, the grandson of the head of the Buraku Liberation Movement in Japan. Mabuchi, the Minister of Land and Transportation, who had been the Vice Minister, a venture capitalist who created his own successful company at the age of 32. There are a lot of interesting people in this cabinet that represent a new style of politics and new views. This is, what is not, I think, fully appreciated is how important the last election was in bringing in a whole new generation of politicians into Japanese politics. It's the biggest turnover of political leadership since the purge during the American occupation. And there are at least, 80 some odd people, either as minister, vice minister, parliamentary secretary, or in the cabinet office, who are getting experience into how to run a government. So over the next several years, several of these people will emerge as significant, interesting political leaders. In that sense, there's reasons to be optimistic about what is going on in Japanese politics. The question is, how well is Khan going to do in dealing with a host of difficult domestic and foreign policy issues? Here again, it's interesting how skeptical the public is. As I said, his popularity is about 65, 70%. There's a poll that Yomiuri ran the other day that asked people who favor the government why they did so. The largest response is because he stood up to Mr. Ozawa. But only 2% said because they believe Khan has leadership ability. So that tells you something about what the public is sort of wait and see attitude about this government. It's very tough. You want to be hopeful that this time the DPJ will get it better than it did the first time around. But the problems this government faces, not only the problems about the policies themselves, but the infrastructure. This is the second largest economy in the world. It's a big country with a lot that the government has to do. You go to the Prime Minister's building. It's a beautiful new building, right? There's the staffing of the Prime Minister's office is so inadequate. The lack of access to expertise is so strong. The newspaper today had a story about how Khan and his cabinet had a 5-hour study session, Benkyokai. Well, now, give me a break. What is the Prime Minister and his cabinet minister sitting around for 5 hours talking about policy? That isn't going to get you very far. That's really spinning your wheels. He has no, as far as I know, he has no foreign policy brain trust. On economic policy, it's very unclear who's in charge. Mr. Noda is finance minister. Mr. Kaeda is the minister of economy and fiscal policy, but he's in the cabinet office. Not clear that he has any. He doesn't have anything to run. The National Strategy Bureau now is headed by Mr. Gemba, but it's not a bureau. The legislation never got passed, so it's only an office which Khan intends to downgrade. So who's in charge here? No one's in charge here. What some people think is what the result is that the bureaucrats will be in charge. But this is a system that in which, and I must say, the key people in the Khan government are like Mr. Sengoku and the guys who work for him, Mr. Furukawa and others. They're very much aware of this, and they're looking very hard they're studying very hard how the White House is organized and how 10 Downing Street is organized. But they have to try to build a system while at the same time running a government. That's not an easy thing to do. They eliminated the Council on Economic and Fiscal Policy, which was so effective under Koizumi. And there's no one like Takenaka, and so on and so forth. They got a major fiscal policy dilemma. Just like the US and other advanced countries, there's a need to have to continue a stimulus and to get a deficit under control. And publics in these countries want to see it all happen at once. So the result is a lot of halfway measures in Japan. On FTEMA, there was an agreement reached between Hatoyama just before he resigned and the Obama administration to move this Marine Air Base, which is centered in this base in a very heavily populated area, to a more remote area called Henoko. And there was an agreement signed. It cannot be implemented. At least it cannot be implemented until after there's a governor's election in Okinawa in November, assuming that the newly elected governor will agree to it. Very unlikely. So how does he manage this issue with the U.S.? And it's not simply a question of where to put this base at Futenma. It's a much bigger issue. How do you reduce this American presence, over-presence, in Okinawa? Uh, um, there's a lot of concern, as you're well aware, in Japan about North Korea, about China. Now you got a big fishing and big dispute about the Senkaku Islands and so on. I'll come to that in a minute. So growing support for an American military presence in Japan. But, you know, the not in my backyard phenomenon is very strong in Japan. People say, yes, it's terrible that Okinawa, you know, all these bases are in Okinawa. But okay, do you want it in your own prefecture? You can't find welcoming prefectures for the American bases. So what do we do about this base structure? What do you do about the U.S.-Japan security relationship? Khan is not deeply familiar with these issues. Hodda is to a considerable extent, but this is a government that's going to have to deal with some very tough issues and is not well positioned to do so. Now we have this tension with China over this fishing boat that collided with two Japanese patrol boats in the waters around the Senkaku Islands. And the Japanese arrested the captain of the fishing vessel and sent back the vessel and the crew, but they've kept the captain in custody and have extended it. And this is becoming an issue of growing, an escalating issue in Sino-Japanese relations, with demonstrations around China, public demonstrations that the government seems to be trying to control, but also with the Chinese government taking a very hard line position, and the Japanese doing the same. And what this is all about is the Chinese are trying to set down a marker that the issue of sovereignty, of which country has sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands, is an open question. That the Chinese are trying to make the point that they have claims on Senkaku. And the Japanese view is there's nothing to discuss. This is part of Japanese territory. And the U.S. Will sooner or later have to come out publicly in support of the Japanese, Japanese position. So, will the Khan administration be able to deal with these questions, with these issues effectively or not? Only time will tell. There's going to be gridlock for the next 3 years until the upper house election, at least until the upper house election in 2013. As I said earlier, there's little likelihood of cooperation between the opposition parties with the DPJ. I think there's little chance that the parties will split and reorganize anytime soon. Eventually, something may trigger that, but not right away. Dramatic policy initiatives, I don't see them happening. Agricultural liberalization, the agriculture minister, he was the agriculture minister when the LDP was in power in the 1980s, Mr. Kano. He's a good mainstream agricultural protectionist. I don't see there's any movement there's likely to be any movement towards liberalizing Japanese agriculture. The party, the DPJ, is committed to at least put forward legislation to sort of reverse the postal reform legislation. It probably won't pass, but they're going to have to give it, make the effort. So if Khan gets into trouble, which is easy enough to imagine, the most serious opposition that's likely to confront him is from within his own party. Because Mr. Ozawa is down, but he's not out. And he will try to find an opportunity in which to once again challenge Khan. He won't do it directly. There'll be someone else that he'll put forward as the front man. But this is a party that combines elements from the right wing of the LDP to the old Japan Socialist Party. So You know, my view, I guess, at the moment is that so far so good for Mr. Khan. He did well in the DPJ presidential election. The fact that he defeated Ozawa, stared him down, refused to compromise with him, it's kind of putting that old style Tanaka Kakue style politics behind the DPJ. All of that is good. He has a good cabinet, interesting cabinet, some interesting people in it. He's shown that he's pragmatic. He speaks much more cautiously about relations with, about foreign policy, and especially about relations with the U.S. You don't hear coming from Khan, you know, a more equal relationship or this, that, other thing. He basically talks about the importance of the U.S. alliance. He wants a good relationship with China, but he's very realistic about China and doesn't romanticize the relationship like I think Mr. Hatayama did to some extent. So there's some good things happening. But political turmoil in one way or another is going to continue in Japan for the next several years. I think, and I've said, this is a process of creative destruction. Undoing 50 years of LDP dominance and creating something in its place doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen smoothly without problems. And eventually, something will, you know, the dust will settle, and a new party system will emerge. But the world moves on, and Japanese politics is kind of stuck. So it's going to be a rocky road, and in the meantime, I think very little is going to be done on the policy side that's going to respond to the issues that Japan faces either domestically or internationally. So that's a pretty gloomy picture, but that's the picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry.
We'll now do Q&A. Do you want me to recognize people, or do
Sure,
you want to
you do it.
recognize people? We have two mics, and raise your hand, and we'll give you the mic, and identify yourself and your affiliation. Speak to the mic, and then Jerry will answer your cogent questions. Down here on the front, on the left, first mic, down here. And then, do we have anybody on this side for the second mic? Up here in the middle, okay, here in the middle. Yes. Can you give him the mic? Raise your hand so they can get the mic. Yeah.
Great. I'm Alicia Ogawa, one of Jerry's former students. You talked with such enthusiasm about the quality of the people in the cabinet and Mr. Furukawa, but in an era where Japan has to become more internationalized, where reform has to be undertaken, where entitlements have to be dealt with, given the demographics of the voter population, how do these people get out of bed in the morning, and how do they deal with the fact that what they have to do, is probably not very welcome for the older voting population?
It's not welcome by
the older voting population.
Because the population is old and
right.
and cranky.
Right, and it's probably not in favor of immigration or entitlement, cuts or reform of agriculture or deregulation of media. How do they handle it?
With a great deal of difficulty. But I think this is what political leadership is all about. Now, sure, the population is aging. Older people are interested in having the government provide all kinds of services, and they're probably concerned in a sense about their children and future generations, but not as much as they are concerned about themselves. All that is very true. But I think one of the key features of the Japanese sort of public mood at the moment is that so few people have strong views about what to think. They don't know what needs to be done to get this country that so many people think still has a lot of potential back moving again. And that's what political leadership is supposed to provide. some sort of a vision, some sort of an ability to persuade the public that this is what needs to be done. So, you know, when did Koizumi leave office? 6 years ago? That's not that long ago. And the people who are old today weren't that much younger 5, 6 years ago. But Koizumi convinced the public that you had to cut medical expenses, that you had to raise the copay, that you had to swallow some bitter medicine, that you had to cut back on public work spending and on road construction. And the public bought it. And he won 2/3 of the seats in the Diet, basically by making the election a referendum over whether to privatize the postal system, which most people didn't think was such a great idea. But they believed in Koizumi, and Koizumi thought it was a terrific idea and that it would be important for the country's future, and so they went with him. That's what's needed. And that's the question, whether Mr. Khan or Mr. Maehara or the younger people, when you think about Japan, 5, 10 years from now, the names that are going to dominate, I think, are going to be Mr. Noda and Mr. Gemba and Maehara. And do they have that kind of ability? Will they be able to persuade? There was a professor here at Columbia when I think he was still here when I came here as a graduate student decades and decades ago, and then he shortly left thereafter to actually found the Kennedy School. He wrote a book called Presidential Power, and the definition of presidential power was very simple: the power to persuade. That's what political leadership is most about. It's what Obama seemed to be able to do the first year, but you're beginning to wonder if he's lost the touch. But the ability to persuade, the ability to persuade Congress or the Diet, the ability to persuade the public, the ability to persuade is a key. And so if some of these leaders, these younger people, have that skill, I think there's ways to get the public to go along. But at the moment, so there's no evidence that Khan has that ability. You hope he does, but I think that's the only answer to your question.
Question over here.
Yes, John Koch, I'm a political science graduate from GSAS. Thank you for your presentation, Jerry.
Oh, John.
Yeah. Could you touch upon how the leadership delineates between foreign and domestic policy?
I'm sorry, say it again?
Policy, their approach, does it differ if they're dealing with foreign policy or domestic policy issues? And more specifically, what can we look for as Japan hosts the upcoming APEC meeting? And how is Japan adjusting to the rise of China in terms of where it fits in, where it sees itself fitting in Asia? Thank you.
All in 60 seconds. Not literally.
I guess my impression of this government, it's only really a few days old, but from what I know of Khan and the others, his personal focus is on domestic policy, social policy, even in a sense more than economic policy, social policy, and on foreign policy, he's going to defer a lot to Mr. Maehara. And I think what we're seeing on foreign policy is a return of reliance on the bureaucrats. I think this government is much more receptive to the views of the senior Gaimusho officials on policy towards the U.S. and towards China and so on. So I think you're going to see a kind of bipartisanship on foreign policy, in the sense that where this government is coming from and going to is not very different from what we saw under the last years of the LDP. Defense Ministry has now asked for an increase, for the first increase, I don't know, decades in the the allotted number of army army people in the army, of soldiers. There's no evidence that they're increasing the defense budget, but they're going to take a much tougher line on defense, and it's aimed at China. There's growing concern, obviously, about, same kind of situation as with the U.S. You want to engage the Chinese and sort of ride their economic wave and benefit from it, and at the same time, there's a concern to balance Chinese power. So that drives Japan and the U.S. closer together, and it's also driving Japan to shift its own military strategy towards being able to deal with contingencies involving China. I mean, the Japanese Navy around the Senkaku Islands is very strong, and it's there all the time. So, and at the same time, Hodda has been said publicly that he appreciated the fact that the Chinese government was trying to deal with this issue. I think it was something to the effect that it was trying not to let it get out of control in terms of public sentiment and so on. But this relationship is in for a very hard, very tough haul. That's all I can say. But unlike Mr. Hatoyama, who relied on the advice of outsiders who were sort of critical of the way the alliance has been run with the United States, Khan Mayahara are looking much more as kind of mainstream, taking a mainstream traditional approach to foreign policy. I think there must be a strong sense of relief in Washington at this change in government, and a feeling that they can talk to these people much better than they could before.
Over here.
My name is John Baker. My name is John Leisure. I'm in the East Asia Regional Studies Program. I think in your talk, you've identified a lot that's not working in the political system. There's lots of fragmentation, and I agree you're spot on about there's a lack of leadership that's very troubling. If you could identify something in the political process that is working, I mean, what can the leaders of Japan look to in these tumultuous times as sort of like a beacon to lead them forward? I mean, there must be something that's working. The Shinkansen still runs on time. I mean, how can they lead forward based on something within the system?
Yeah. Well, luckily the government doesn't run the Shinkansen. And I think that's a big part of, one of the good things that's happened is that the role of government in the economy has contracted. It's not 20, 30 years ago when, administrative guidance from MIDI was what the businessmen followed. So a lot goes on in this country. It doesn't have much to do with politics, thank goodness. In politics, well, I've mentioned this sort of political leadership change. That's very important. And so there's this new cadre of younger political leaders with more modern values, more cosmopolitan, more experience in the international world, internationally than was true in the past. They will find a way to restructure the relationship between politicians and bureaucrats. They can't go back to the system as it had been played before in this kind of bureaucrat-politician alliance. So it's still in the process of being worked out, but it will be a more responsive, more transparent, more open system. So in terms of political process, I think there are good things happening. They'll strengthen the Kante, the Prime Minister's office eventually. But there's a kind of there's a lack of sense of urgency in what is done that suggests that all these things will take a lot of time. in the meantime, a lot of things don't get done. So yeah, in long term, there's a lot of favorable trends, but I guess it was John Maynard Keynes who said, yeah, and in the long term, we're all dead. It's getting from here to there that is the problem.
Hi, Daniel On, adjunct assistant professor here. Thank you very much for your time and remarks. I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit about the reversal of the post office, postal bank privatization process and what you think that means for the broader economic reform agenda. Thank you.
Well, as far as I know, I've been away from Japan now for a month, for a couple of months, and already I feel a little bit out of touch. But I think what this is something of a kabuki play that's going on now, in that the National People's Party, Kame's party, is part of this coalition government, and Kan made a commitment to push through postal reform. So he will go through the motions of doing so. I can't see how it could possibly pass unless the LDP were to divide internally on this issue. It's very unlikely. So I think the measure will go down to defeat, or it won't actually come to a vote. But Kan will put the best face on it vis-a-vis this minor party in his coalition. So I don't think this reversal is going to go, and is that this bill has much of a chance to pass. That is not to say that it will continue to be privatized, because things have kind of stopped, and I think that's where it'll be for a while, kind of in limbo.
Yes. That's you.
I'm Barbara Rush. Jerry's remarks are so exciting to hear about the new cabinet. However, there are two issues that came up in my mind. Everyone wishes there were an Obama and a Koizumi with the charisma that these kinds of people come with. But when I look around the Japanese political scene, although these are wonderful people on the new cabinet, I don't see anybody on there who has charisma except maybe Renho, and I'm a big fan of hers right now. But I would be very grateful if you could make a comment about the governors around Japan and their relationship to all of these things. Some of the most dynamic young governors are, for example, Osaka's young governor, who looks like a high school student almost, but is very, very active. And Higashi Kokubara in Kyushu leapt into leadership over this hoof and mouth disease situation when the central government didn't seem to be doing anything. And I would love to have your insights on the relationship between prefectural governors' powers and prime minister and so forth, in
Sure.
comparison maybe
Thank
to the U.S. and the state governors and Washington and so forth.
Right. Well, first, I think unfortunately, you don't see anyone, even among these attractive younger people who are in this cabinet, who at least so far has caught fire and demonstrates that kind of charisma that one would hope someone would be able to would come up. As for governors, one of the people in this cabinet, interesting person in this cabinet, who is the new Minister of General Affairs, Somudaiji, who's Mr. Katayama, former governor of Totori, and actually a former bureaucrat in that ministry, but one who was, when he was governor, was very tough on the bureaucracy, cutting salaries and getting better control over them. So what you see in Japan is some of these former governors sort of on the fringes of Japanese central government politics, or in this case being brought into the government. But unlike the U.S., where you don't know who's going to be the challenger to Obama in the next presidential election. But you can be pretty sure that a few governors are going to try to make it. In Japan, you don't get anywhere in the central government unless you're in the Diet. So there are a lot of attractive, the really attractive politicians in Japan seem to be more at the local level, especially at this prefectural governor level. But they don't have strong links with the parties. In fact, they reject direct links with the parties, like Hashimoto in Osaka or Higashi Kokubaru in Miyazaki, and so on. And there's no way under this constitutionally for them to make a run to become prime minister. You got to be in the Diet. And once you're in the Diet, you got to be in the Diet for some period of time, because seniority, even with, in the DPJ as well as in the LDP, has a role to play. And you wonder how much of a shelf life some of these governors really have. Higashi Kokubaru is not going to run again as governor of Miyazaki, and he's talking about running as governor of Tokyo. And he spends an awful lot of time on TV, wide shows. You wonder how he gets much work done. I don't know. I think there's something of a fad quality to some of this. But in any case, Barbara, I think the more important point is that few of the governors have much of an impact on central government. But Hashimoto in Osaka, maybe one of them. The DPJ, everybody talks about decentralization. DPJ and the LDP, I don't think they really have much of a sense of what it really means, and they talk about it as though Japan's going to be more like the U.S., but they don't know much about how it operates here, or all the problems we have with our federal system. Anyway, now I guess the short answer to your question is that there's a very limited role for these governors, and those who do want to, have dreams of becoming prime minister, they got to run for the Diet. And once they run for the Diet, they kind of get sucked up into the system. So,
we have next one is going to be Professor Weinstein. I want to ask the last few questions to be asked by students, and so there are a lot of hands that were up. Are there any students on this side who have a question? Okay, you get the next mic, and a student on this side, yes, you'll get the next mic after Professor Weinstein. David?
So I really enjoyed your talk.
You should identify yourself. I'm sorry.
Would you just
well, David Weinstein, my colleague at the Institute and professor of economics here. Yeah, David.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and fully agreed with your short-run forecast, which was that there's going to be gridlock over the next few years. You seemed a bit hopeful that things were going to change in the longer term, but I guess as I was listening to that, I was thinking hope is not a theory, and that there are lots of smart people in politics in Japan, but when one looks at what's happening, it doesn't seem to see the reasons why there has to be coalesce, why the political parties have to coalesce into ideologically driven parties,
Sure.
or even into two big parties. If anything, It looks like it's going the other way. So is there a reason to believe that long run things are just they kind of have to go in a better direction, or could we end up with a government that's fragmented and ineffectual for a long time? We certainly have seen that in economic policy making. Things can drag on for decades, and will we see something similar in politics?
Well, hope springs eternal, as we say. I think the chances, and I meant to suggest as much, the chances that this will drag out, this kind of this, if not turmoil, this inability to come to grips with key problems, that this will simply drag out for years, to the point where it becomes too late to deal with a lot of these problems. I don't underestimate the possibility of that happening. All I was suggesting is that public, seems to me that the public's awareness that Japan is in a deep rut and and is going to continue to decline unless some dramatic action is taken, that sense is strong. The willingness to actually do things that are painful is very weak. But with if you have political leaders who can make that strong, convincing argument, I think there's a chance that they could have some success. After all, we saw what Koizumi was able to do, at least in terms of, there's a question of how much he actually got done, but in changing the nature of the debate and in pushing issues that people thought had no chance of being adopted, I think he was very successful. So I don't want to be I don't look at the future through rose-colored glasses at all about Japan. I think they're in a terribly difficult situation, and politically it's hard to see how they're going to come out of it. But we haven't seen the end of turmoil and kind of a settling down into a kind of a genteel decline, and kind of a stable politics that's ineffective. No, there'll be more. Something will trigger something again, which is why I'm not predicting how long Mr. Khan is going to be prime minister. This is the process of undoing 50 years of LDP rule is still underway, and perhaps with some of these younger people now rising to positions of real power, we'll see new and more innovative policy. That's all you can say. It would be foolish to say that that's likely to happen. But it would be foolish to underestimate the ability of Japanese to get it more or less right at some point. So that's the kind of unsatisfying conclusion that you have to come to. Yes.
Hi, my name is Shinsuke Hirose. I'm a sophomore at the college. Professor Curtis, first, thank you for your talk about how, first, analyzing how the DPJ fell out of grace with the public and how your predictions for its future. I just wanted to ask a question about what your take is about the splinter factions that emerged out of the LDP leading up to the upper house election earlier this summer. And in particular, what's your take on the major positions of your party, which when I was in Japan, I felt everyone thought was a joke, but seeing the results of the most recent upper house election, everyone seems to be treating them a little more seriously. What do you think their position is, and do you think that they'll be able to continue whittling away at the LDP's popularity in months and the years to come?
So there are several splinter parties, several parties other than the LDP and the DPJ in the game right now. One of them is this party called Minanoto, which for some weird reason they've translated as your party. And they did well in this upper house election, but they won what, 10 seats or so, 10 or 11 seats. That was pretty good, but it doesn't get them. That's not a party that shows the potential of becoming a major force. This party, Minanoto, is the closest to kind of the Koizumi position on deregulation, privatization, and the privatization of the postal system, and what have you. But I think its appeal is very limited, and I think its leader Watanabe Yoshimi is an interesting man, but he doesn't have the charisma that is going to. He's no Koizumi, and I don't think the party has that much growth potential. That's my impression. And they don't think, in a sense, they don't think so themselves. That's why they're hoping or trying to find a way to force a split in the DPJ, further split in the LDP, and form a larger grouping. But I think, as I said, for the time being, not much is going to happen.
Last question.
Hello. Thank you for letting me be your last question of the night.
My pleasure.
It's been
Tell us
wonderful
who
to
you are.
have another sensei in the house for this discussion. I'm Thalia Sutton. I am a GSAS student in Professor Shimizu's class,
Oh, good.
enjoying learning all sorts of new things. So, when the DPJ turned over a bunch of the seats in the House, it was by big majority of seats, about a 2/3 switch. And in the next election, it was a much, much smaller turnover of seats. And when I hear discussions about the Japanese politics right now, the scientists seem to be of the assumption that the DPJ will stay in power just kind of indefinitely. I don't ever hear anything about what if they don't, what if it turns back over, and I'm not sure why. But my question is, is the DPJ making in-house decisions that indicates they think they will be in power for a long period of time?
Well, no. The answer is no. They don't know any better than you or me what happens in the next lower house election or upper house election. All I know for certain is that what Mr. Khan wants to do is not have an election for 3 years. He's of the view that the only way to overcome this gridlock without actually revising the Constitution and maybe changing doing something about the upper house, the only way to resolve gridlock is to have double elections. That is to time the lower house election with the upper house election, and to create a kind of a customary law that the lower house will last for 3 years. It makes a lot of sense. Whether it can actually be carried out or not is another question. So his preferred course is not to have an election. DPJ will lose seats in any case, but not to have an election until the next upper house election, which is 2013, right? That's as far as they're thinking. Can they use this time, hold off the demands from the opposition for a dissolution, get some legislation passed that the public appreciates, try to convince the public that the obstacle to Japan getting its act together is not the DPJ but the opposition parties. That's what that's what he's going to try to do. No one can force the prime minister to call an election. It's his, except a vote of non-confidence. And there's not going to be a vote of non-confidence unless the DPJ splits. So the chances are that he will not have an election. There won't be an election now for a couple of years at least, possibly not until the next upper house election. And that's as far as the eye can see about the political goings-on in Japan. What happens at that point or leading up to that, whether there's party realignment and so on, well, that's a guessing game. There's surely, as I said, there's going to be more turmoil. No one can I don't think anyone can predict what it's going to be, but this is still, a work in progress. That is replacing LDP one-party dominance. And to get back to the point that David Weinstein was asking about, in the meantime, policy doesn't get done. Important policies don't get done. The easy way out is taken. Publicly unpopular issues like immigration are going to be not touched with a 10-foot pole. Agricultural liberalization, it's not going to happen. If anything, the DPJ is likely to move in the opposite direction by providing income support subsidies for farm households. So you want to see. It's important to see that there are positive aspects of this change. On the whole, despite all the gloomy news that I was trying to convey, It's really a good thing that the LDP lost power last year and the DPJ came in, shake the system up, get new people into government, change reduce the power of long-established vested interests, try to grope for a way to deal with the problems that Japan faces today rather than the problems it faced 20 years ago that were met by a lot of expenditures on construction and so on. Doing this kind of kangaroo court, jigyo-shiwake of these public reviews of government expenditures. Some of it is misplaced. They're going to, some of it is unfair maybe, but on the whole, it's making the system more transparent and I think more responsive to the public. That's all to the good. So there are some interesting good things happening. And now, Mr. Khan, who's here in New York right now and will be talking at the UN, when he goes back home, he's going to have to show that whether or not he has real leadership ability. No one knows yet, but we'll find out soon enough.
Jerry, thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you. I think you've been a very attentive audience and lots of good questions and continued demand for questions, such as life. But I guess maybe others share my view that, Jerry, your comments have driven us to drink. And so let's go to a reception. Thank you all again.